Good evening and welcome to yet another stream on my channel. I haven't published an essay in quite some time, but right now I'm here with, uh, I don't know, this is going to be an interesting introduction because I know this writer well from Substack mainly, but I think you're more of a neophyte to the YouTube and podcast sphere. My guest today, I should say, is Isaac Young, who is an author and blogger on the Substack Tranter Publishing. He has a number of serialized novels. I'm not exactly sure if any of them are finished yet, but you can check that out there. And what I am more familiar with, though, is his work in literary criticism, which is something that I have a lot of interest in. And in particular, what he's talked about and what I hope to talk to him about today is the subject of the declining culture of the early 21st century. How, in many ways, we've lost a handle on what meaningful culture could or should be, and how things have become so thoroughly disenchanted. For those of you who use Twitter, I think people probably know Isaac Young best for his instigation of the great media literacy wars of 2023 with his infamous thread on Starship Troopers. But thank you for joining me, Isaac. I've probably gone on long enough.
Yep. Thank you for having me on. I've been a huge fan of yours for years.
Oh, thank you. By the way, the audience can tell us if the levels are proper yet. Between you and me, I think on my end you're a little bit soft, but we'll just have to play it as it comes. I guess maybe you could overview. You've done a number of articles on sort of the disillusionment of popular culture and how things have seemed a lot less magical when they come to things like science fiction and fantasy. I think that we both have a lot of memories going back to classic science fiction, like Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. I know you've written a lot about that. Did you have any speculations on the causes of this, or exactly how the development of these authors have kind of how their influence is traced across the century?
So I guess I should start with one of my favorite science fiction novels is Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of encapsulates my just dissatisfaction with the genre. So we'll start with the first one. The first one is about an exploration of this alien spaceship, and it's unique in its plot because it doesn't have much in the way of character development. It doesn't have much in the way of conflict. It's purely just looking at this magical, almost numinous creation and trying to understand it. And the book ends with a teaser for that there are going to be more spaceships coming, and it hints at this transcendental purpose which we can not comprehend in the slightest. And that's what a lot of what atheist science fiction does. It hints at this transcendental cosmic meaning that we can't even begin to grasp.
And that was very true of the early science fiction novels. And this is going back a little bit further, actually. When I remember reading Rendezvous with Rama, which is an unpronounceable title. Getting past that, I definitely remember that one. And I remember that, and it's no mistake that Arthur C. Clarke was, he was the inspiration / co-writer of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which very much captures a similar attitude of a numinous awe and just the simple fact of exploration, plus the sort of spiritual fear that strikes you when you encounter a purpose or a teleology that you don't fully understand, which is perfectly captured in the 1969 movie. But it strikes me as kind of going back to an earlier type of science fiction that you would see in something like Jules Verne. early science fiction, like really early science fiction, whether it was Jules Verne or H.G. Wells to a lesser extent, their novels were just simply about exploration. There was not some sort of plot or great crisis that needed to be resolved through the characters' actions. They just explored this new thing in a new dimension, and that was enough to kind of carry the plot.
Yeah, and well, I was gonna continue with the Rendezvous with Rama thread, because what the reveal of this, big purpose that we can't possibly understand. What are these the constructs of ancient gods? What are they all for? And you find out it's just Reddit atheism. Like that's all it ever is when they peel back the curtain and actually have to reveal the teleology. It's just Reddit atheism.
Yeah,
It's standard liberalism. Like
there is no mystery other than the fact that I think that was true too with Arthur C. Clarke when he wrote sequels to 2001. He said that, like, oh well, the monoliths are just like I think he called them intergalactic Swiss Army knives for creating more intelligence, like they're intelligent manufacturing machines. And I remember reading that and thinking, this is the greatest anticlimax of all time. Does life have any purpose to come into communion with the monoliths? Is it just it's just a checkbox? Is it supposed to create as much life as possible or as much intelligence as possible? I mean, it felt like such a cop out that there was nothing there behind the entire endeavor.
Yeah, I was recently on a stream with the Prudentialist, and we were discussing Prometheus. And oh my gosh, just imagine my blue balls when they awaken the alien and basically ask, what is the purpose of mankind? And he just flips out and just kills people. He doesn't actually say anything. He just flips out.
Plus, he looks so much like Mark Zuckerberg. It's
Uh,
almost identical. It's Mark Zuckerberg without hair was the engineer from Prometheus. I think both you and I did have a little bit of a soft spot for Prometheus. I remember thinking this could actually be a really fascinating movie if it wasn't part of a franchise, or if they spent more time on the sort of existentialist aspects rather than the jump scares.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately my relationship with Prometheus was kind of ruined before I could get to watch that initial introduction. If I watched the initial introduction without any context whatsoever, I would have so many good memories of that movie. But I knew that it would turn into a horror slop film just from the cultural osmosis around it. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't get to just experience that point in the story where you feel like it could go anywhere. I didn't get that. Yeah. I was like, oh, when does the alien show up?
When's the jump scare coming? When's the jump scare coming? I mean, I guess that's, that is what is sort of a fundamental crisis in all of these creations, is an understanding of teleology and what the exploration is ultimately for. I think another one that kind of was a prefiguration of modern science fiction was the Foundation series, which obviously you take your icon from. And this is something that's been discussed endlessly by reactionaries. Foundation is a remarkable cultural artifact. First, it's based on Gibbon's decline of the fall of the Roman Empire, I should say, which was an 18th century shit-lib take on ancient history, 100% Whig history, where all of the crises of the Western Roman Empire are essentially blamed on the Catholic Church. And it's furthermore that this idea is abstracted by a 20th century shitlib, Isaac Asimov. And still, even throughout all of that, the series has moments and raises questions that kind of point towards an actual understanding of history that's more sophisticated than the one we have in modernity. I'm thinking of the entire subplot with the Mule and Second Foundation, which is just, I mean, that's sort of, and it's not really elite theory, but it's grasping at some of the Demastrian concepts and some of the Spenglerian concepts behind those things.
Yeah, if I ended the Foundation series at the first 3 books, I would have been like, "This is fantastic." And
I did end them after the first 3 books, so
oh yes, you were spared. You were
I was
spared for
spared. I
yourself,
thought it was
Mikey.
it's a Foundation trilogy, right? I had the book
Yeah.
called the Foundation Trilogy. It doesn't need to go any further.
Yeah. But yeah, the Mule is essentially a great man of history, just trying to pry open from the bureaucratic uh, chains of what basically Harry Seldon laid down nearly, I guess, 5 centuries ago from the Mule's perspective. It's just liberalism going on, and you're trying to see a man trying to shape history instead of being subservient to forces beyond his control. And I posted about this in one of my articles where I said the Mule's a sort of protagonist in that he seems to how do I put this in the right words? Like there's so much about his character that seems to be he's more human than all the rest of the characters in the trilogy, at least in my view, because he's a deeply flawed man, yet he's also trying to reach out and touch something that's real beyond the political. And
Yeah, he
unfortunately, we
actually
never.
is an organic being, which is untrue of virtually all the other characters, which are just these little flesh puppets of Selden's plan.
Yeah, I mean, literally all the rest of the characters are just subservient slaves, pretty much. It's it's depressing, but it's
It,
true.
it's strange because your sound's coming in at like half the volume of my son that's screaming in the next room. So if I
Oh,
pause
sorry.
suddenly, just take that with a grain of salt because I'm probably dealing with some background noise. But anyway, the yeah, I mean this is the thing. I think a lot of reactionaries have have raised this question, most prominently Morgoth reviews, and that is it was, and this is sort of quite obvious to me as well, like insofar as there is a cycle of civilizations that goes on in the Spenglerian sense. This is fundamentally an organic process, and if you were to take that organic process and essentially short circuit it through the use of super advanced mathematics, the utility of that process would be completely destroyed. The organic being would then become sort of an emulsified specimen immersed in amber. The whole point of a civilizational cycle is to essentially flush out dead ideas that are dragging the genetic line down, and to bring in new religious vigor. But if the foundation is allowed to essentially bridge from summer to summer of the civilizational cycle, then I mean, not only, I mean, first of all, I mean, it doesn't make any sense in terms of the fact that it's itself imponderable because it contains many decision makings of equal or greater magnitude in the future, that could essentially anticipate these events and then react to them. But it also destroys the entire understanding of the cyclical view of history to begin with.
Yeah, I would say like Harry Seldon's psychohistory is just C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. That I couldn't have put it better myself. You know, this is the hypothetical moment in history upon which all people essentially preceding it are not as powerful, and all the people succeeding it are essentially its puppets. And Harry Seldon is that pivotal historical moment in the abolition of man through technology. So the struggle against the foundation is essentially the struggle for organic life.
Yeah, the interesting thing that comes up with the fourth and the fifth books is that what happens is you see Isaac Asimov realize this to some extent. I remember reading some interviews where there was some criticism about, okay, is the rise of another galactic empire necessarily a good thing? And he apparently wrote the fourth and the fifth books to answer this question. And so once the abolition of man option was tried, tested, and Isaac Asimov found wanting, he switched over to this spiritualist answer in Galaxia, which is essentially a hive mind. Not it's essentially if the Borg were the good guys. If you can kind of
Yeah, I know. I remember this
if
from
you imagine
yeah.
that.
I mean, actually, and it's a common sci-fi trope, actually. But it's a common sci-fi trope. This was, I don't know if you've ever played this game, but there was a game from the 90s called Alpha Centauri, which essentially had that as the good ending for, it's a sort of like a civilization game in space, or a sequel to Civilization 2. And the sort of good, you become the Borg, but good is considered the good ending.
Which, like, I've heard of Alpha Centauri. I never played it. I've heard a lot about it. It's sort of, it's reaching for what was originally a Christian idea, which is basically communion with God and your fellow man in heaven. Which, if we look at heaven, what it is the perfection of our fallen natures. It's a perfection of our relationships with both other men and God. And the hive mind is just a science fiction equivalent of a Christian heaven, essentially.
It is funny though how the authors can never really imagine a hive mind that is simultaneously transcendental and also not horrific. To return briefly to a book that I definitely wanted to cover, I apologize if you haven't read this, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, which I think is his best book.
So here's the sad thing. That's I literally have the book not 2 feet away from me. It's on
Oh
my
no.
list.
Okay,
I
well,
haven't read it. I know the plot because I watched the miniseries and I
sure.
read the Wikipedia page. And it's, I know it's basically it's the science fiction version of Revelation or Apocalypse, and it's about humanity ascending to this transcendental state, ironically through demons.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I
for
don't want to
oh,
spoil it for you, but the transcendental state is horrific
yeah,
and completely devoid of humanity. And the way it's written about is horrific.
yeah. It's
The
the
author is
children get
really, and
abducted.
what?
The children get abducted. At least they do in the
No, I mean,
miniseries.
not really. I mean, the children just sort of become autonomous and like
Oh,
cut their parents off and become kind of like zombies of this overmind.
I guess that's even worse.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely horrific the way that it happens and it occurs. And the author is really careful, and this he does it the same way with the sort of demonic aliens. I don't know if they're sort of spiritually demonic in the context of the story, but they look demonic. The he plays this game where he tries to describe events through an objective zero values lens, but the things that he's describing are, from any person's perspective, totally horrific and perverse from a human point of view. And so you're left with this development, and you're kind of being asked to welcome this as good, but there's no way you can possibly look at it as a human and call it good. It's kind of fascinating. This is why I call it his best work, because uh I don't know if I don't know exactly what his point was in all of this. Probably he didn't have one, but this is a very landing point about conceptualizing a historical development that is fundamentally anti-human. And by what humanistic ethics can you embrace that future or fight against it?
I don't know much, but I don't know much about Landian politics, sadly. But like, just from what I understand of Childhood's End, it's, I mean, maybe you could try to attempt to justify the horror with a greater sense of being and meaning. like, you know, how Christianity has to grapple with the problem of evil.
Yeah.
But even that's totally lacking. Like they never come up with an answer to that question.
No, and the whole idea of science fiction of this era was fundamentally humanist, which was, I mean, you see this in Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. This was, you know, this is kind of a natural segue. I mean, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, which is, you know, eventually gave us the most notable vision of the demonic overmind in the Borg, was essentially imagining a humanistic technological society. But they did this and they portrayed this in a way where humanity was sort of fundamentally static in ways that are ridiculous and kind of impossible. I mean, to give the example I always give, you know, Jean-Luc Picard is sort of, I don't know, people quibble with me over the facts of this, but he's depicted as sort of the scion of what the Federation has to offer. He is a representation of what the Federation is. But a man like Jean-Luc Picard could not be produced by a society like the Federation with no scarcity. And furthermore, the only way that they can kind of explain his thoroughly, I want to say, this reactionary attitudes and mannerisms is by claiming that he's part of some kind of Luddite colony inside Earth that wants to do things the old ways. And this is how you have this kind of classic personality. And so this is something that all science fiction of the 20th century struggles with, is how can you apply humanistic ethics to a humanity that is in the process of dehumanizing itself?
Yeah, the interesting thing for me about the Federation is that the Federation is always expanding, always growing, but it always remains the same.
Mm-hmm.
Like the bridge of the Enterprise never changes. The ideas, which, yeah, I remember the finale of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where Q puts the crew of the Enterprise through the final test, or specifically Jean-Luc Picard. And the final test is whether or not he's willing to embrace new ideas. But the whole runtime of the show is him not embracing new ideas in any way, shape, or form. And
it's the prime directive, right? That the prime directive rules everything in Picard's mind.
And and the only revelation he gets out of this entire test is not some morality or theological end. No, it's just this, oh hey, I have a slightly better grasp of quantum physics, I guess. And that's it.
Well, you see, this is the thing, that this is it's funny. I absolutely love the last episode of Star Trek:
I do
Next
too.
Generation.
It's amazing. It's like
it's
moment
brilliant
when Q whispers into Picard. Well, doesn't whisper. Sorry,
But it's funny you mentioned the lack of spiritual teleology, because that's the last thing that Picard asks of Q, and Q is about to tell him, and then he doesn't. And then what happens to Q after that? He's literally lifted off the stage by this machine. Right? He literally is the Deus Ex Machina being transported off the stage, like in Greek tragedy. I get that, you know, throughout the whole trial, he's constantly being propelled around on this platform in a judge costume, a futuristic judge costume. So it's kind of amazing. Gene Roddenberry was aware enough to know what his show was missing. He didn't have an answer, but he knew that it was missing, and so he put this kind of, literally, this god that's lowered in by a machine straight into his universe, so that they could grapple, so that the characters could grapple with it in a way that was actually something to be satisfying for an audience.
As I watch that scene every few months or so, where Q leans in to whisper in Picard's ear, and it's almost like God reaching down to tell Job what the meaning of his suffering is, and then he pulls away, and
see, that imagistic motion would have infinite meaning if Q were the servant of a greater God.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
It feels like a cruel trick in a universe that lacks one.
Like I made a my latest Twitter controversy was how Prometheus was using religious themes. That is a religious theme right there. Like the moment of Q leaning in to whisper into Picards' ear, that is a religious impulse that sci-fi writers are using to create a compelling story. That's something that's visceral, that's real in a way that real atheism, real liberalism just can't get at. And we're playing this throughout the entire story of Star Trek. We're playing this bait and switch. We're going to engage the harsh concepts. And I remember this specifically because I get so frustrated with every single episode. We're going to engage the harsh concepts. We're going to do morality plays. We're going to go in and we're going to ask the hard questions. And yet always at the 11th hour, those hard questions get shuffled off stage in some convenient solution that completely ignores the questions that they were asking. Like, you have god entities that are, revealed to be in universe. Yeah. What are the metaphysical implications of these? I don't know. We're not going to talk about this again.
And they're oddly incurious about them. They're oddly incurious about them. They treat them. The Federation treats these beings that are obviously spiritual. The same thing with the gods. I mean, if you've seen Deep Space Nine.
Yep.
But it's funny because they kind of take it a step further. Like they have sort of Q-like or god-like entities that live in the Bajoran wormhole and that are actually accurately worshipped by the Bajorans as deities and can only be described as deities. What's the one thing that the Federation is not interested in? These divine beings. It's almost like the Federation has to ignore them. To like, if they acknowledge the existence of Q and the Bajoran wormhole gods, like their society will fall apart or something like that. So they have to suppress this the same way that they have to exclude knowledge from primitive societies in the Prime Directive.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into this literally all day. If someone gets duplicated, do they share the same soul?
Well, I know that's the classic question, right?
The teleportation incidents happen in every series, and we never get a good answer to these questions. Holograms coming alive, the nature of AI. It just goes on and on and on, and it's always resolved at the 11th hour with the duplicate dying, the problem solved with a technical problem. And I mentioned this in one of my earlier essays, is that the problems of Star Trek are always about a lack of knowledge rather than really making a really hard choice. Like, it's always some technical solution. Oh, we just need to rewire the quantum phase evaporator to supercharge the phasers.
The rear deflector dish.
Yeah.
The Janeway solution, as I call it,
Yeah. And it's always about a lack of sufficient knowledge, and when that fails, the authors use Deus Ex Machina to wheel the interesting conundrum away from the stage. And because it's serialized, not serialized, episodic, we never really maybe there's one or two exceptions, but we never see the answers ever.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put this in front of you as maybe a segue. It struck me that across the 20th century, science fiction began more progressive with things like Rendezvous with Rama or the Jules Verne stuff, where it's just a mode of pure expansion into an unknown and an embrace of whatever that implies. But then as sci-fi comes into contact with actual questions that need resolution, almost all good science fiction develops a distinctly more reactionary flavor to it. And I think that you see this when you move to things like Dune and popular science fiction franchises like Star Trek and Warhammer, which obviously borrow heavy, or Star Wars and Warhammer, which borrow heavily from Dune. But and also things like cyberpunk. I mean, cyberpunk is in many ways a reactionary genre because the idea of progress is completely undermined. And sort of the stark realities of human choice are kind of laid bare.
Well, actually, first I want to engage with Warhammer 40K because I was recently thinking a lot about that topic, and I was thinking about someone asked me, what do you think really makes Warhammer 40K reactionary, or what makes it so resistant against wokeness? And I was thinking about that for a long time. My first answer was that they actually have a concrete version of hell, so
Yeah.
that oh, you want your space sci-fi story to be reactionary. If you have demons in there, it's kind of hard to dispute that they're the bad guys. And what do they stand for? They're the bad guys. And no matter how bad your side is, at least they're not literal demons.
Yeah.
So you always got that going for you. But
And the demons operate in ways that are very similar to how demonic spiritual entities operate in pre-modernity. They prey upon weak souls and deceive people, and they're ultimately concerned with the fate of the spiritual, not the fate of the physical.
yeah. My newest interpretation of that answer is Warhammer 40K doesn't have the same aversion to violence that other sci-fi properties really have. For example, all right, so the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, the Enterprise is going to a new unexplored region of space, and Q basically tests them and accuses them of being ultra-violent.
Yeah.
And basically puts humanity on the test because humanity is violent. Whereas Warhammer 40K just accepts violence as part of the from a Christian perspective, this is wrong because if we lived in a perfected world, then violence wouldn't have the same dimension. But in the fallen world, violence is part of the condition of the universe, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And Warhammer 40K accepts this rather than treats violence as a temporary embarrassment on mankind. And that's what so much of science fiction does, is it treats our violent past as a temporary embarrassment on the road to the glorious utopia.
Even Star Wars did that a little bit. The nature of Star Wars, and the reason why people love it, is the fact that it is reactionary. And when it was released in the 70s, people viewed it like, what made it sort of imagistically distinct was its incredibly reactionary medieval quality to it. I mean, they're literally fighting with swords, and they call themselves knights. And a lot of people who are fans of Star Trek really hated it for that reason. But one of the things about Star Wars is that it tries to temper this with sort of this weird post World War II liberalism, and half measure of 1960s aphorisms that you get from Yoda about the peaceful warrior type deal, which certainly there's part of a tradition to that inside all Western philosophy and Christendom. But the problem is, for that reason, Star Wars always seemed to be at war with itself on a fundamental level.
Yeah, the light side is fundamentally against violence, yet they engage in lightsaber duels.
Yeah.
Like the Jedi are supposed to be pacifists, except they're not when it comes to the Sith. The KOTOR games covered this a lot better. I would have to really rush up on them before I could comment on them, because it's been a long while since I dusted them off. But the problem with the Jedi is being put forth as the good is that I've always seen them as they're just self-abnegation. I don't really get at what the positive good that they put forward, except I guess this communion with nature.
Yeah, they're very, I mean, this is originally the Jedi were more of a cipher because you only ever met two of them if you exclude Luke in the original trilogy. So I think the questions of how the Jedi actually operated when they were an act of order was easy to kind of ignore and to project your own desires onto. But by the time you get to the prequels, they turn them into sort of weird new age space Buddhists.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, I mean, it doesn't even really make any sense because they're the de facto secret police of the Republic. They're 100% involved in politics, no matter how you cut it.
Yeah, and if you read the expanded universe lore, it's like I don't even understand how the group that most doesn't want to be involved with politics somehow is at the center of everything. And that's just sort of a writer's thing, is that they're somehow the secret police, but they're also completely against the secret police in every every ideological lens they have.
We don't have a secret police. We just have psychic agents that go around and manipulate foreign leaders to do our bidding, and then killing people who might be plotting against the central government. While negotiating peace deals on diplomatic missions. That's the job of the Jedi. I mean, that's the secret police for sure. But I get. I mean, like Warhammer has a certain purity in it that you just don't see elsewhere, and this is what the whole debate. And this is the whole. I mean, we're getting into the whole media literacy thing too. I mean, like, I have this bad habit of watching leftist YouTube videos when I'm doing something mindless like chores, because I'm so curious how they think. And they don't, like, you have people who are obsessed with Warhammer and they don't even understand why people fell in love with it. The reason people fell in love with Warhammer is that the struggles that are shown in Warhammer feel historic. If, for instance, you make Warhammer an inclusive setting, it will immediately resemble the old world a lot less and become another version of Star Wars. What is it? I mean, with chainswords as opposed to lightsabers, and with bolter guns as opposed to blasters. The whole point of the thing is to essentially have hard constraints. And there's so many people who don't understand that. They're just here for the power armor and the bolters and the symbolism for it that, that's completely hollow. I just don't understand it all. And it's kind of amazing watching these media literacy debates play out.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with, I guess one of the spiritual problems with the woke is that it reduces every property to be indistinguishable from every other property. I I posted a screenshot from, this was a while back. I posted a screenshot from the Acolyte that had like 3 figures in it. And I said, all right, one is Star Wars, one is Star Trek, and one is some other third property. Can you tell me the difference between these 3? And then everyone was like all over with the answers. And I'm like, it's all from that one Acolyte show. And
did you actually watch the Acolyte? I've only heard people complain about it.
No, I'm not going to subject myself to that.
No. It looks terrible.
I'm not the critical drinker.
Were so bad that I didn't even need to see the last one. But by the time Rian Johnson got his hands on it, I just said to myself, there's no way they can land this without just making it another piece of woke slop entertainment product.
Yeah, I'm not the critical drinker. I can't sit down and watch the show, make a 5-minute video, and make thousands of dollars off of it. I'm not watching that. maybe if I made a lot of money off of providing just the standard critiques, maybe, but you can't be bothered for that.
Well, you have to talk in a silly accent and act drunk.
Yeah,
you have to have some kind. I mean, back in the day of 2016, you'd be surprised what you could get away with on YouTube in terms of just making channels that critique the left. I mean, it felt more relevant then. These days, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how people can watch Critical Drinker. I mean, I guess my wife does to a certain extent, as kind of like a movie reviewer. But previously, again, back 10 years ago, there was this understanding that potentially there was some kind of conversation going on around these properties. But now it's really clear that there just isn't.
Yeah, I've had a lot of discussions with another YouTuber, King Emperor Penguin, also a huge fan of his.
Oh yeah. I have a big have a big pile of books that I need to write reviews of, and his are on the stack.
But we had a bunch of discussions, not live, sadly, but we were talking about the YouTube critic community, and it's like we're just aghast at how we thought that, like, in 2018 there was this huge upswelling, this cultural backlash, this movement even that we were going to voice our displeasure with Hollywood, and Hollywood was eventually going to change its ways to fit the consumer. That did not happen. It did not happen in the slightest. It got 100 times worse.
I'm still trying to figure out if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because part of what I've come to realize over the course of the last 10 years is that it couldn't, because Hollywood is so like the vision of the late 20th century is so spiritually bankrupt, and it's so small and constrained that you really couldn't make good science fiction and still color within the lines of what's acceptable inside Hollywood to explore.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, like we were discussing, and I didn't know about his thoughts, but I thought that, eventually the outrage machine would lose steam, and to some extent it has. But what I witnessed with the Acolyte was, okay, we're going to be super outraged about this show that we were all expecting was going to happen, that we all knew was going to happen. And yet everyone's acting super surprised and super angry that their product has been essentially raped for the 1,000th time over.
I know. At this point, they're just going at a corpse.
Didn't you understand the message when Luke Skywalker drank alien breast milk, essentially? like when they were comfortable enough to show that as part of a main trilogy, didn't you understand that, oh, this is what Star Wars is?
And when they had everything having to do with the Last Jedi was just this direct message that the franchise was done with its fans and was now going to become a Disney product of saying whatever they wanted to. I mean, the thing again is that what are audiences supposed to do? I mean, I know what people like me and you think that they should do. I mean, obviously, we believe that they should declare war on the modern world and attempt to find a fan community organized around something that feels more real. Hopefully, whatever that cultural product is, centered around a more real spirituality. But people aren't trained to do that. That is orders of magnitude heavier lift than anything modern consumers have been asked to or trained to or pointed towards in their entire lives. Just streaming Netflix and chill and hanging out on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tragic thing in all of this is that, again, I have to reference King Emperor Penguin because we had a lot of discussions about this. He wrote an article, I think it was called a Spotlight to the Moth-like Masses. And it covered the inability of mainstream audiences to disconnect themselves from modern properties, and the just utter frustration that indies have in trying to attract any kind of following to make it financially viable. There's a lot of people's I commented about this even like just a few hours earlier, that a lot of people think that you should just do this for the passion, for the joy of making the thing. But the thing costs real money,
in real
just
time.
For my own time is a lot more fungible. But here's the thing, I can't draw for the life of me. I can't make a cover art for my book for the life of me. So I would have to invest like 2,000 hours to get good at trying to create some good cover art that will make a reader interested in the story that I have spent a another, it's even more so, 2,000 hours trying to perfect my craft of prose. You just like that cover art is $500 to $600.
I understand. I mean, and I know you've been trying to use sort of LLM generated images to bridge that gap. And, I've been skeptical, but I think that for your purposes, that is one of the uses of this technology that is valid.
Yeah, my rule of thumb is I use LLM technology for anything that I can't afford to buy cover art for.
Mhm.
And whenever I can make a real investment, like let's say in a cover art for an actual book, then I will shuffle forward that money. But for like let's say chapters, I can't I can't afford to spend $600 on some chapter cover art. So I use Midjourney, and
Mm.
it's worked decently well, and it gets across the images that I want to get across. There's a lot of constraints, but
And, no, of course,
it
that's,
works.
yeah. I mean, we all have to use tools that are available to us, considering we're doing this all part time, or at least I am for the time being. The logistics of getting an alternative art scene up and running are just a nightmare, especially when the art scene is perceived as fundamentally hostile to the mainstream. I think we've seen some success on this in the publishing side of things, and this is really where I'm going to write an article on this, I promise. And my article writing has been very much delayed the last month and a half because of an enormous amount of family activities or family obligations and moving that I've been doing. But my ambition or my hope is that the publishing, the sort of the emergence of dissident publishing and dissident book clubs is going to develop into a culture of dissident literary criticism. In many ways, I speculate that dissident literary criticism has to essentially come online before the emergence of a really, really powerful scene when it comes to developing new literature and new entertainment products.
I definitely agree with that. I'm still on the side that we're going like even for criticism of literature, which can hypothetically take place online. I'm still of the mind that there has to be an IRL component to it
Mhm.
before it can really take off. Because I personally, in my own life, I've seen the difference between trying to organize something online and something in real life, and it's night and day because
Oh yeah, yeah. That's this is you've hit the nail on the head, and this is one of the reasons. When I first started this channel, not when I first, but not 3 years in from starting this channel, bunch of my online friends and I tried to develop an organization, uh, called the Candace Society. And
I'm actually a part of it.
oh, really? Okay,
I joined after it was sort of quasi left to.
the timing was terrible because it was just before COVID, and also I had to drop out because I had a new kid, and all my time evaporated temporarily for the first 6 months, like it does when you're a new father. But the problem was we did it backwards. I didn't know, at least, who were the people who were kind of in it in real life and the people who were kind of there for the entertainment of being on a Discord server where it seemed like something was going to go on. And of course, the online communities, in addition to attracting some genuinely good people, yourself and about 20 other people that I can think of off the top of my head, it also attracted the worst people on the entire internet, which I immediately came into contact with after starting the project. And I'm not going to name names, but I have in the past. And the lesson from my own point of view was that the online needs to grow either in tandem or out of a real life presence. And this is the reason why I put so much emphasis on the conferences, the basket weaving, e.g., community building meetup groups, and on the little mini dinner events that we're hosting increasingly now. I think that is what you have to build your online presence around in order to really operate independently, not just from the mainstream that hates us, but just from an endless number of weird people online that are going to waste your time.
So here's the really interesting thing, especially in regards to any authors out there. So I held a book signing event at the college I went to, and the sales I made from that one particular event alone, basically, I just set up a table in front of the lunch hall and just sold books for like $15. That still makes up a considerable bulk of the total sales I made ever. And it's
Nice.
it's interesting that like I guess you can theoretically air quotes make it as a completely online author, but when you actually have a table somewhere where you're talking to people, where you're in like a moderately active area where people are passing through, it is a lot easier to make a book sale than it is to market online.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And you know, part of me, this is selfish, but part of me has been looking for the return of the short story. The 20th century was not good for the short story in American fiction. We went from Henry James to Joyce Carol Oates, and that is not not progress as I see it at all. But I keep on hoping that in the early 21st century, the short story is going to reemerge, because I would just love to be able to pop open a book and read small pieces of fiction from authors like you and a variety of other people, and then use those short pieces of fiction to give to other people to get them interested in your novels and in your other work.
The terrible tragedy in all this is that I'm I'm getting better, but I never really been well versed in the short story.
It's a
I've
hard
always
medium. It's a very hard medium.
it's extremely it's a lot. I remember I was reading this Flannery O'Connor quote where she says a book is a marathon, a short story is like a 100-meter race, and I completely disagree with that,
Mhm.
because oh my gosh, like there is so much that you have to get and work into a short story that it becomes a novel unto itself. And I have by no means mastered that craft. I love taking my time. I love slowly developing scenes. I love build up. Whereas
Yeah.
in a short story, you don't have any of the time for that. You
No.
you have to like get it all done in like 5,000, 10,000 words. And it's just, oh my, I'm working on it, but it's by no means my preferred medium.
Well, it is something. I mean, this is the short story form that people like Ray Bradbury mastered, and it's kind of, I think, the last great short story writer of the 20th century. But it is a very difficult medium. I mean, I've tried my hand at it a few times and I haven't been too great, but maybe I'll try again. Who knows? One thing I kind of wanted to talk to you about, and we can just let the conversation go as it will, but I definitely wanted to hit on this thing about, you know, in my mind, culture has been on basically been going downhill since the 70s or 80s, very, very slowly. There's still good stuff throughout the 90s and the 2000s. But the last gasp of cultural vitality really hit in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And there are a few shows. The one that I kind of prominently want to bring to your attention is the one that I felt best bookended the entire phenomenon, which was Adventure Time, which is sort of the perfect encapsulation of the Gen X to millennial transformation. And it's funny because it begins as sort of a surreal comedy adventure story. And then over the course of its runtime, and you've written about this too, I'm not ambushing you with this, it develops existentialist themes. and it starts drawing on deeper and oftentimes more reactionary concepts. But then the series kind of gets to its terminal phase where eventually the hero's cycle has to come to a completion, and it runs out of gas, and it essentially becomes this millennial piece of fiction. It degrades into anticlimaxes, into false growth, which you point out in your essay, in weird millennial humor where you break up sort of necessary dramatic tension with an inappropriate joke to sort of take a serious quandary and kind of trivialize it with irony. And at the end of it, and I think it didn't end terribly, Adventure Time. It was passable, but you could see the direction that storytelling was going from its creators, and they did not, under any condition, want to give the audience the kind of ending that would have to that a story like Adventure Time would have to have. I mean, it was a post-apocalyptic surrealistic adventure story, and on all of the major questions, it kind of punts.
So I guess I have to frame my reaction to Adventure Time and my own experiences with the show. So I have a very scattershot, like it peppered my childhood, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I never was able to follow up on the major plot lines. I got the understanding of what it was very quickly, but I could never really unfortunately, I can never follow all of its story beats, because at that time I was just, this is TV. I flip on the TV. Oh, Adventure Time's happening, and I didn't get to binge watch everything, sadly. And my relationship to the later series was mostly over YouTube, in sort of trying to get at the major plot beats. And I was very disappointed of the direction of Simon Petrikov, which I made very explicit in my essay, because it always seems like a juvenile sort of tragedy. Oh, the universe just won't let us be together. Where you have two characters who are separated by circumstance, but not by a failing of the other, but rather just a general, the universe has fucked you over.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I get with a lot of Adventure Time. There's just so much, when you really when you dig beneath its cheerful veneer, you get at a deep longing. Especially with, I remember watching one of the early episodes where Finn is going after a tribe of subterranean mutants he thinks are humans.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he realizes that they aren't humans, they're mutants, he's sort of left perplexed, and the episode doesn't really go on from there. He's sort of left with this.
He asks Jake, were they human or just animals? And Jake answers, we're all animals. I remember that episode. It was a weird question.
Yeah. And there's this just undercurrent of just horrible tragedy that never really seems to be. I mean, Simon Petrikov, he goes through he goes to a therapist, but that doesn't seem to be enough to sort of reconcile with everything that has happened. You feel like there has to be this redemptive element underneath it all to justify it, and it never shows up. You just get more answers of, oh, the circus will continue.
I think I think you mentioned this in your essay, but the central quandary, I mean, there's obviously all these existentialist questions that we can always assume that modern entertainment will never answer, because it's not in the business of answering existentialist questions affirmatively the way that more classic media would. But of the more personal arcs that you would expect to have resolved, even in a modern 20th century piece of fiction, would be the central one over Finn the human eventually coming of age and growing up, which is always hinted at. Like, he always progresses, but it never actually occurs. Finn is always about to grow up, never actually a grown up. And what's strange is that you see you the movie will kind of, or the show will flash forward and show you the protagonist as an adult, but these are always treated as sort of false futures. And I think what you bring up in your article is the message that Finn is eternally a Peter Pan character caught in this perpetual adolescence.
Like, in order for him to really grow up in Adventure Time, you'd have to struggle with one or two possibilities. Number one is he really is the last human, and he has to seriously grapple with that question, as he is the last of his kind, which that is not territory Adventure Time is ever going to explore in any sense. The second one is him being a heroic figure and bringing back humanity. I'm not well versed in the show enough to.
They actually do discover other humans, but in the course of the show, he does not take leadership over them, which feels like an incredible missed opportunity of the variety you're talking about. So they literally regarded that possibility as an ending and said, no, we're not doing that. Let's continue the weird adventures in the Candy Kingdom.
Yeah, I know he meets his mother again. I can't recall when he finds other humans, but the second possibility would be him finding humans again and leading humanity in this weird new landscape.
Yeah,
which is neither option the show is willing to take by any means.
Well, I mean, in the 20th century, the happy ending would obviously have to be the latter one of those two. Without that, the show is tragic. But the show just shies away from either the tragic ending or the cathartic ending, and just gives us, oh, hey, the point of the show is to be the show. The point of Finn the Human is to be Finn the Human, the eternal adolescent.
Yeah, and it's tragic in how unfulfilling it is. Because and I'm going to use this as a segue into my own topics for a little bit.
Sure.
I've never, like, there are very few books that I've put down and I felt really spiritually fulfilled by. And they're very, like, I get emotionally invested in a lot of series, but they don't feel like spiritual food to me. At least none of the modern ones do. And I remember when I was first reading Book of the New Sun, and I got to the famous scene at the end of the fourth novel where Severian is standing on the beach, and I put that down, and I felt like I've had a genuine spiritual revelation in that moment. Yeah. And I was thinking then, and I still think now, I was like, oh my gosh, if only science fiction had a more mature relationship with the religious, if only Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, if all those famous authors had a genuine relationship with this, the transcendental, that we might have had stories so much more like Book of the New Sun than these half-limping narratives, which hints at, you have to read almost against it at times, which hint at a greater purpose, but never seem to get it. I mean, I have this scene at the end of Book of the New Sun where Severian is standing on a beach and he realizes all creation is sacred, And he has this Moses moment where he takes off his sandals, throws them into the ocean because the sand beneath his feet is sacred sand. And he goes and plucks a thorn from a thorn bush. It's so magical. It's so transcendental.
Mhm.
It blew me away, and it literally reopened my imagination to what fiction could be. And I'm just constantly disappointed with previous authors.
I mean, Gene Wolfe is a high standard. I'm rereading the book series now. It's been a while since I've read it, so I'm on the last book, about to get to the part where you're describing. And I mean, I think he might be the last great science fiction writer of the 20th century, or maybe even ever. Who knows? Maybe this is as far as science fiction as it was conceptualized in the 20th century can go.
Science fiction is atheism conceptualized, as far as that can go.
Well, then I guess, I mean, Gene Wolfe certainly doesn't count.
Yeah, I would
I mean, it kind of
really.
reminded me of
Oh,
this
sorry.
older book that you should probably look into as a writer. It was written by a heretical Christian called David Lindsay. It's called Voyage to Arcturus from the 1920s. A huge inspiration to C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, and kind of puts forward a vision similar to Gene Wolfe's, but much more Gnostic.
I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's a trip. It's a trip.
Yeah.
You'll either love it or hate it, but it would be something that I would recommend for my viewers for sure.
Yeah, I unfortunately can't comment on it, but I will say, as for my predictions of where the sci-fi genre will go, I think the Reddit atheist version of science fiction is dead. I think it's it's been dead. They can't replicate it, even with modern shows like Star Trek Discovery, which is just the culmination of Reddit atheism, which is just woke diversity garbage. Everything's woke diversity garbage these days. Like Reddit atheism is dead. And that part of science fiction, which was Reddit atheism, is dead too. That's undeniable. The question is, was science fiction ever more than Reddit atheism? Which personally, I think it is. I think there are compelling parts of science fiction which are more than that, which reach beyond that. And I think those are the parts of science fiction will survive. There's this so a good show I like to bring up, for example, is Stargate Universe. It's widely regarded as the worst Stargate property besides maybe one other, but it's widely regarded as Stargate turning woke. But the premise of the show is basically this expedition gets trapped on this spaceship, which is headed off into the unknown cosmos, and it's a lot like other liberal shows where it hints at a god figure, but it never really gets into this god figure. Basically they get trapped on this spaceship launched millions of years ago that was launched in search of a purpose or transcendental meaning of the universe, and the ship is called Destiny. And you have multiple scenes where you have characters like staring out into the beauty of the cosmos, and you have characters speculating on the meaning of creation, and you have characters looking out into the universe and trying to come to, in as much way as a liberal can, a relationship with God. And I think those parts of science fiction will survive, in whatever way, shape, or form they do. I think that the parts of science fiction that looks at the beauty of creation, the relationship of man and technology, will survive in the long run. It's just not that Reddit atheism of, oh hey, we're gonna make God the liberal God that says, oh yeah, violence is evil. We're going to condemn humanity because they're not living up to liberal utopia.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that the thread you draw out, I think, will eternally be a thread in human aspiration. The question is, will this come to us in the form of science fiction? And looking back on authors like Heinlein and Asimov and Clarke, what will we really take from their work that's meaningful and that we can incorporate into new things? I think the problem with our aspirations many times, Isaac, is that we kind of want the mainstay of the population to be in a more advanced state than they actually are. And that sounds horribly condescending, I know. But given that we're all kind of coming to terms with modernity, one of the major developments in one's own maturity is to kind of realize the false avenue that is the Reddit atheist perspective. And I'm not even talking about the atheism of the Reddit atheism perspective, but just the kind of blank, comfortable self-satisfaction of living in a technological age and then judging all previous ages as being inferior to your own. And I think that all good art exists on the other side of that revelation. The problem is that for the most part, modern audiences are not on the other side of that revelation. And so exposing them to culture of that variety is jarring. And no one's really found a good way of doing it yet. Certainly, it's hard to do without the cooperation of the mainstream, which we certainly don't have. But this is really the task of people who are interested in artistic endeavors like myself, or people who are actively engaged in them like yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the main problem of the distant right is trying to elevate human appetites to transcendental, seeking the transcendental. This is one of the topics I kind of prepared for before the live stream. A lot of people on Twitter say literature is dead. It's not dead. It's degenerated into porn.
Yes.
Because when I go onto a site like Royal Road or Wattpad, literature is well and truly alive. It's just been completely subsumed by erotica and fan fiction. Like I go onto these authors' pages, and they're reaping $500, $1,000 a month, which it may not be a lot in terms of funding a lifestyle, but that's a lot in terms of funding your own artistic endeavors.
Yeah.
And seeing where that money is going, the problem is not so much that we have an art problem, it's that we have a porn problem, and that the vast majority of funding goes to porn.
Or, I mean, unless the audience gets kind of confused. I mean, if you look at something like YA or young adult literature, what you see in the modern world is this it's basically like extended fan service. It's beat storytelling put in place to not really enlighten the reader, but to kind of make them feel additionally self-satisfied and to give them the exact kind of narrative they want about their own lives. And you see this a lot if you go to a fanfic forum dominated by women, that all stories seem to resolve around kind of creating these idealized narrative structures with a perfect self-insert character right at the center of them. And okay, I mean, is it pornography in the literal sense? No, but it's a certain kind of spiritual pornography, to be sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's all serving the appetite, and not just the transcendental appetite. Not at all the transcendental appetite. It's just the baser appetite of, I want to live this guy's life where he does everything perfectly, where I have failed.
Or this girl's life, where that's the most common sci-fi story. Like, girl finds herself in the middle of a giant conflict of good versus evil, and she's oppressed, but then she meets this great guy and they save the universe together, and it's like this impossibly cute romance that has everything work out in every dimension. And you see this emerge in fanfic. And I remember in high school and in college having several girlfriends that wrote fanfic on these forums, and you read this, you read this writing, and you think to yourself, you're not even writing like a book that you would want to read. You're writing like you've constructed your internal daydream fantasies. And how could anyone else want to read this? But over the course of the human centipede that is the internet, having this slop cycle back and back and back and back in on itself, we've come to kind of like these female self-fulfillment fantasies being green lighted across all major studios, and absolutely devouring what remains of the literary sphere these days. Modern novels are unreadable. Maybe I just had bad luck, but I don't know, I can't get into them at all.
I don't even try.
I think David Foster Wallace was the last one I did, or something like that. But you go to these book groups, and these novels are just absolutely terrible.
Yeah, they're terrible because they don't really look for anything higher than satisfying really, really animalistic appetites. I mean, would I find a novel about... Honestly, it's hard to put into words.
It would be more fun if they were animalistic appetites. Like the Conan the Barbarian novels, like early pop fame, are more gratifying than the YA slop that it comes piling out of every major publishing house these days. Because there's a certain amount of awareness about what it is, and there's a certain amount of visceral passion in it. And the problem with YA stuff, or YA tier writing, which is most writing these days, is that it constantly has to pretend that it's something that it's not.
I mean, here's the thing about Conan. Conan reaches for something real. Like, I can look at Conan and I can, like, for example, again, King Emperor Penguin, he wrote a really good essay on this when he was watching 300, that movie about Spartans at Thermopylae. Yep. He was like, oh man, like this movie like makes me want to work out. And I'm like, that's real. That's a reaction I had with that movie. Like, oh, seeing those guys defending, like doing a last stand, doing a a battle, and they're all ripped as hell. Like,
the
that
epic
makes
Trent Reznor soundtrack in the background that like I can listen to on repeat.
Yeah, that makes me as a man want to go to the gym and work out, and that is so much more real than this YA slop that's just about emotional vibing. Like, at least I can look at 300 and say it inspires me on the most primitive of instincts to at least a higher thing where I'm actually physically fit, because you can separate the, like, you can look at the physically fit and see this as an ideal. It's a very
even the original Robert E. Howard stuff. I mean, this is actually very close to pornography in some sense, in that it's a male fulfillment fantasy. But, and I am a huge Conan fan, huge. All of his characters are great. Solomon Kane, all the rest, whatever. Red Sonja, although I think he only wrote one story, and it wasn't the one that eventually became serialized by Marvel. But those stories about the barbarians in the ancient Hyperborean world, they did sort of touch on that numinous quality that you have lingering in the background of something like Tolkien or Wagner's The Ring Cycle. Like, there's an element of that there. It's translated through incredibly crude language and comic book style storytelling, but I like the fact that that thread is still there, and if you want to tug on it, a whole world kind of opens up from what you might follow on. I've never seen anybody, you can just, like, if you go to book, you ever heard of Book Talk? I'm going to be writing an essay on this, but Book Talk is this brain dead version of TikTok where predominantly women brag about the books they have written, which are all these kind of airheaded, modern fare that they organize into color-coded bookshelves. And I've never seen anyone get out of those good read circles and come into contact with anything that was ultimately greater. Some of the girls read Jane Austen, but I'm not even so sure that they really internalize the spiritual worldview of Jane Austen. I mean, how many of these Jane Austen book clubs that I mean, I know intelligent women who read Jane Austen, and they actually do try to kind of figure out the core human elements and the core spiritual elements that Austen is pointing at. But for all of these sort of book talk bimbos, I mean, they're reading this to check it off a list and to kind of make it sound like their literary fulfillment fantasies are part of some greater tradition, which they're absolutely not.
So to get back to 300 before that thread is severed completely, I do want to say, like, the thing about Conan, and the thing that makes it so vitalistic is that it understands a core fundamental part of masculinity, in which masculinity is a sculpture that is chiseled out by the men themselves.
Yeah.
And you can look at Conan and you can say, all right, maybe I don't agree with his morality per se, but I agree in the virtue of his strength and his ability to achieve his ends, which is in itself a virtue. And you can look at that and you can desire that in your own life, and those stories can inspire that in your own life. And in that sense, Conan retains the vitalistic component, which basically makes it a classic. That, there's been a lot of pulp authors, over the years. Why is Conan remembered? That is why Conan is remembered, is because he embodies this vitalistic aspect, which is eternally true, which a lot of pulp authors don't really get at it to the same extent.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's well said. I'll point out here for the chat that's watching us, we are doing entropy chats. If you have a question for Isaac or me, we'll probably start answering them in about 10 or 15 minutes to close out up to the 2-hour mark. But yeah, I mean, I guess there's one thing I will say, though. I do think that in many ways, I feel like going back to pulp might be a misstep. I don't exactly know what's supposed to come next in the imagination of Western man, but the whole let's try to resurrect Conan the Barbarian. Something seems like we're not really grasping with what the real opportunity is. And I thought maybe it would be to kind of try to look at cyberpunk and revive that. But that's just speculation on my part. It seems like there's some dimension of human desire that we're really not capturing in the modern digital age properly.
So what I'd say for that is that the problem with the modern pulp movement is that the original pulp movement was a reaction against the civilizing of man. Mm-hmm. What the new fiction movement needs to embody is the reaction against the bugman, which isn't it's not the same thing as the reaction against the civilized man, because the Conan was the reinvigoration of the barbarian inside the civilized man. But we don't have the civilized man anymore. We have the bugman. And what the bugman needs is not physical force. He needs a religious meaning. He needs a transcendental meaning. He doesn't. If the bugman goes to the gym and he works out, that's fine. That's great. But that does not solve the bugman's problems.
Yeah.
What the bugman needs is he needs a vision of the transcendental in a view of the, I don't want to say afterlife, but he desperately needs something that points to a greater purpose. Conan the Barbarian is great and all, but he doesn't have the religious zeal that the Bugman is deprived of. And that's what I think the future of science fiction needs to embody, is the sense of the reimposition of purpose onto our lives.
That's a tall order, certainly. I'm wondering, I mean, the question is, when you put it that way, all I can think of is novels that are written in highly religious societies. I can't think of a novel like that written in an irreligious society or the winter of civilization that can be recognized as such. I mean, I don't think that you could have something written in Boethius's time, which is, you know, like the supremely irreligious age. I mean, you know, there was an emerging Christendom that was springing up from the ground, but novelizing that would be almost impossible. And I think that maybe it would be better expressed in poetry or something like that. I don't know. I'm still struggling with this question myself. Maybe we're in some sense consigned to constantly relive the 20th century until there's sort of a spiritual revolution on the ground that comes up through an organic faith. Although that's kind of a depressing prospect.
Yeah. I would. It's going to cut into my market, but I would love if poetry had a revolution over prose, because poetry. So I was in college my senior year, and my professor set me down, and he was I asked him to, and I was like, all right, explain to me the beauty of poetry. And he outlined how sound and rhythm and the meaning of the word all interplayed into one another to provide the meaning of a poem. And he did this through the poem of Ozymandias. And that was like, there's a spiritual awakening on my part.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I want that to happen, I don't think that's possible to happen on a mass consumer scale. I just don't think that's possible. Like I had a one-on-one with a savant, more or less.
No, of course not. And that's one of the things about poetry, is that there's an intimacy there that prevents it from being massified.
Yeah, like
do you remember? Do you remember you may not have watched this, but the Democratic Convention was about a little less than a month ago, I think, and they had the poet laureate there give a speech, and just this incomprehensible kind of jive gibberish for a solid 10 minutes. It feels like it feels like you trained Chat GPT on Maya Angelou and threw in some modern neologisms from Reddit, and that's what it spit out. It's a type of poetry that's designed to be expressed on stage in a slam setting, but also at the same time, unlike the slam poetry of the Beats, to be accessible to like a very, very low IQ audience. And so what you get is this utter, just this verse slop pouring out of this person's mouth to the point where it just feels like it's a self-parody.
Yeah, I remember when he was giving this lecture on Ozymandias, where there's this purposeful, I can't remember exactly, but there's this purposeful break in the rhyme scheme that's supposed to symbolize Ozymandias's fall from this, King of Kings to this, this monument of wretched stone that's weathered and torn and sundered. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's genius. But there's no way that the modern audience is going to ever get this. And there's no way that we're ever going to convey this to the mainstream. It was terrible.
In some sense, I felt, this is something that is going to naturally evolve, is that as our value system departs radically from that of the mainstream, our language will too. And poetry that we use to discuss things and describe things will become a way of expressing ideas in ways that are indiscernible or indecipherable to authorities. There was this whole idea that Kryptos put forward about 4 or 5 months ago about creating illegible culture for the mainstream. You're speaking in a language that's not parsable through the mainstream, and because of that, you're able to express more and be in some ways accountable to the authorities for less in your pursuit of these ideas. And I always think that something, this is a poem that we probably quote way too much on the reactionary right, but a poem like A God of the Copybook Headings by Rudyard Kipling, it's just such an imagistically powerful and simple poem that simply reading a few random lines from that just communicates everything about a situation that one would care to communicate to somebody else. And that could be the basis of so much more when it comes to communicating the reality of our cultural moment and hope for the future.
Yeah, I would really love the future of the artistic right to be in poetry. I think it's going to be in prose, just because I have a lot of I follow a lot of guys on Twitter who do poetry, and it's unfortunately just not a market anymore.
I don't think Twitter is the appropriate place to do poetry. I think poetry has to be done online, in real life.
Yeah, I agree there. Personally, I have a total disconnect from that scene. I really hope it happens. I really hope it takes on a form that is, physical. I don't have any part of it. I can't comment on it because I don't have any part of it. But I really, really hope that poetry survives.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess I don't see how it can't. When has there ever been a human civilization that hasn't been based in some sense on poetry? It's more fundamental than is the prose novel. I guess I'm just too much of a believer in the Lindy effect to believe that could happen. That you could literally see a death of poetry in an absolute civilizational sense.
You're probably never going to see a death of poetry. I'm just really hoping that it doesn't. Sitting in that classroom with that professor, you see a beauty in the constraints. You mentioned this earlier, where like the constraint, the hard constraints that really make the art form. And I've never encountered those hard constraints in my entire educational life, really. And I never really I never encountered those in just my, swiping on Twitter or YouTube or whatever. I never encountered those same hard constraints of trying to create something that is embodied in such a way that you have this really beautiful thing crafted out of these rules, which make it into something that's entirely beyond what it should be. And I never really encountered that before. And
The
I'm sort
constraints.
of, I'm sort of afraid for its future, because
Do you mean
like
like physical constraints or constraints of discipline inside an academic program?
I would say both.
Fair enough. Someone's
Like,
saying the Dead Poet Society soured me on poetry for a long time. Yeah, I have to say I really hate that movie. I'm sorry if it's one of your favorite movies, Isaac, but I feel like Dead Poet Society, it gets everything wrong about romanticism, and it ends up making what it thinks it's making look cool look incredibly stupid.
I haven't seen the movie. I know what it's about. And my personal opinion upon that movie is that the best poetry is created against the strongest of grindstones, in which
Mhm.
it isn't about free verse. It isn't about creating what is expressively you. It is about operating within the hardest rule sets and creating something beautiful within that rule set. I think it's the constraints that creates the beauty in poetry.
No, absolutely. Sure. We are at the half an hour before end mark. Did you have any topics you want to discuss before we did sort of just took questions from the super chat
Mm.
or entropy chats? I shouldn't call them super chats.
Let's let this. Give me some time to think, and let's let the super chats go first.
We'll do super chats and then we'll intersperse them with our own thoughts on the random topics they reference here. Unfortunately, this is a Streamlabs, so I can't project them on the screen because it's entropy. I probably should figure out some way to do that, but it hasn't really occurred to me yet. Michael Latornu says for $3, Dave, this question may be off topic, but what's your take on George Carlin? Groundbreaking philosopher or just an out-of-date comedian? Well, George Carlin had an incredible comedic personality. His worldview is 100% out of date, and he is absolutely a predecessor to the social justice warrior or wokies. Even though I think initially he would have opposed them, his whole worldview is the predecessor of Reddit atheism 100%. But that being said, I mean, the man's there's a reason why George Carlin could get up on stage and just read a set of 20 curse words and make people laugh about it, even though it wasn't really that funny. It's because his comedic timing was just so perfect. I don't know. Any opinions on Carlin?
That absolute motherfucker.
You hate him. I know. Okay. I bet you're a Zoomer, right?
Yeah, I'm a Zoomer.
Yeah. Zoomers hate well, I don't know. Do progressive Zoomers like Carlin? That's a good question. I have never met a based Zoomer that didn't absolutely hate George Carlin.
All right, I'm sure there are progressive Zoomers that sort of. I mean, here's the thing: is that George Carlin was embodiment of an old world order that sort of got demolished when the Zoomers came around. So,
and he
I'm
was
sure
instrumental in demolishing it too.
Yeah, I'm sure there's Zoomers that like him for he embodied the Reddit atheism, and so I'm sure there's Zoomers who idealize him for it. But for all the Zoomers who see the show for what it is like I look at George Carlin and I'm like, you destroyed everything that which propped you up. You're nothing more than just a. I don't want to say it in such blunt terms, but you're a hack. I don't know how else to say it.
I mean,
like,
yeah,
I look at you and I don't see anything original.
Ideologically, absolutely a hack. It's let me just pick apart anything that looks a little bit like it might be ideologically vulnerable. The guy had a certain vitality about him. You can see that though, right? Maybe it was a demonic vitality.
I mean, the problem with the demonic vitality is that it's parasitic on the real vitality, and the relevance of George Carlin was proportional to the relevance that Christianity had to the mainstream culture. As soon as it was gone, it was dead in the water.
100%. Yeah, you can't. And this is the problem. I seem to have some fond memory of George Carlin collected in my skull that I'm holding over, but I can't exactly put my finger on what it was. I certainly can't remember any brilliant jokes he told. They all felt like kind of more mean versions of Jerry Seinfeld mixed in with that deconstructive Reddit atheism we all know and hate. But look, I love a vital character, and when you compare George Carlin to the weak sops we have on stage doing comedy these days, you kind of miss the force of personality, even if it was 100% parasitic on undermining an order that is now well and truly dead. but there you go. Paul A for $5 USA. Star Trek, Stargate, etc. often has a character or whole species ascending to a higher plane of existence. What do you make of this? Yeah, this is an interesting thing. So I know maybe you haven't seen this, but my original experience with Star Wars was with my father. My father was a big fan of the original series with Captain Kirk, which is these days kind of relegated to a detail. Most people considering the canonical for Star Wars to be the Next Generation. But one of the early shows that I could remember is it's altogether incredibly positive on technology. But one of the shows in the original series that I can remember was that Captain Kirk had two friends who were sort of ESP or extrasensory projection enabled. And they go through this nebula and they end up turning into like super beings like Q from the Next Generation Star Trek, or maybe to borrow another analogy, a little bit like the children from Childhood's End. And the conclusion of them were that these godlike beings were just too powerful to be allowed to live. They would inevitably become demonic and they had to be destroyed, and Kirk's forced to destroy his own best friend for the sake of humanity. But it always left me kind of wondering, I mean, if the whole purpose of Star Trek is to progress, but now we just encountered something that could only be described as human progress, and we decided that it was bad. So what is the governing arbiter of progress to begin with? If you can experience something that is undeniably progressive and still decide that it is bad for humanity, even while it progresses humanity into something that's different. That's a long take to say that that I think that the transcendence of humanity is something that cannot be conceptualized under humanist ethics. And since Star Trek had humanist ethics, its description of species ascending into higher planes of existence was fundamentally incoherent and had to be treated as evil or as just an iteration of the liberal superstate in order to be properly processed, because they didn't have any trans species or transpersonal ethical system. A take on the question over transcendence inside Stargate or Star Trek, Isaac?
I mean, the fun thing about Stargate is that it was always about the human growth and expansion, whereas Star Trek was always about the incorporation of the alien within humanity, transforming the alien into humanity, and that's sort of always been the it's always been why I love Stargate a lot more than Star Trek. Is Stargate is about humanity encountering the alien, whereas Star Trek has always been about humanity incorporating the alien.
Yeah. I actually don't really know much about Stargate aside from the movie that's like about Egypt. So I'll have to leave it there, and I'll take your word for it for sure. Arthur Davidson for $15 USA. Have either of you read anything from Niven's Known Space Universe? Is that the one that Ringworld is from? I read it like in early high school. I barely remember it. Do you
Yeah,
have
same
any
here.
Larry Niven close to hand, Isaac?
Yeah. My relationship is same here. I read it in high school. I got through halfway part of it. The thing that sticks out to me is so I remember this tiger species that was incredibly animalistic, and there's this other higher advanced species that basically used addiction as a form of control. And this is in the Ringworld book, where basically what this higher species would use is they'd push a button and it would be like a heroin opiate drug times 1,000 on this tiger species, and they would use this addiction to basically control the species into doing what they want. And that was the one reactionary theme I read into the novel before I stopped, because I very quickly lost interest.
Man, it's funny. I must have massively missed the point of Larry Niffen because people always recommend him to me. But that one time I read it in high school, it left absolutely no impression on me. And that's pretty rare. I'm usually really good at remembering books that are, at least fiction books that I read 10, 20 years ago, but this one's a complete blank. I'm not going to dismiss the author, but I must have really missed the point of Larry Niven when I read him initially. But thank you, Arthur. Creeper Weirdo for $5 USA. Have you guys noticed that children's films are weirdly obsessed with robots? That, and they try to make an internet culture savvy film that comes across as super lefty and cringe. When normies talk about this, it's always, they could be darker. I don't know. I guess I grew up with Voltron, so I mean, does that count as robot? Is Evangelion robot kids movies? I can definitely see how modern movies, when they try to become internet savvy, inevitably become more leftist, or they have this weird quality to them. This person, Isaac Simpson, I know I constantly confuse him with yours. There's so many Isaacs, but Isaac Simpson from the Carousel podcast, he's commented that it feels like all of our modern children's entertainment and young adult entertainment are written by a very, very specific set of urban Asian women who are millennials. And their range of stories is incredibly limited to these. I'm thinking of something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which just has this it's supposed to incorporate all universes, and it just is this incredibly limited perspective to this very, very narrow Asian American experience. It doesn't really have a strong self-awareness about what it is.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Zero HP Lovecraft's essay on Zendaya and the multiverse. I know you've read it.
Love that essay.
It's honestly one of the best essays ever written, in my opinion.
It's definitely one of the most seminal ones from the last year or two. It was really good.
I remember.
And that's this quality of tech optimism inside modern children's fiction is kind of a scourge, because it creates these kind of weird dystopian utopian worlds where there's things that are going wrong everywhere, but there can be no political recognition of that on the part of the protagonist. So the protagonist can't want to live in a cleaner urban environment, or to settle down and have kids, or to continue on the family. The protagonist can only want to have a very, very limited horizon of desires that fits into this multicultural world that is simultaneously portrayed as the best possible world, but also kind of dingy and squalid at the same time. I think I'm grasping at the thread that you're getting at with children's films being weirdly tech positive. Creeper Weirdo again says, I think children's films examination being left to childless 20-somethings, autistic cartoon fetishists, and 40-something cat ladies is a horrible idea. Well, you should have. I mean, we've known this for ages. The Rebecca Sugars of the world and Steven Universes. Did you ever have any of your friends really into Steven Universe?
No, I didn't have.
No,
thank God.
I had tons of my progressive friends, especially the women. They were all into Steven Universe. I remember watching that show and thinking, "What are you smoking? This is horrible. This is absolute trash."
Yeah, thankfully I didn't have anyone in Steven Universe. Because of my job, I recently watched the Deadpool and Wolverine film.
How was it?
Oh my gosh, it was like, it is brain cancer. Like, my eyes were bleeding. It was like I felt a part of my soul die inside when I watched that. But the interesting thing about that film was the first thing was it felt like self-referentialism finally absorbed itself. in the sense that like so much of the film was about just nostalgia bait.
Yeah.
And it is so dystopian and alien coming from a person who doesn't have any connection to that. I remember they were like referencing like Cassandra, who was apparently like a sister to Charles Xavier. And I'm not a comic, like I didn't grow up with
Not the
comic
original character from the Trojan War epics.
books. Apparently there was some sort of sister who was also bald, who also
Oh no.
who also was like a Xavier sibling, whatever. Point is that like I looked at that film and I was like, how am I supposed to interact with this when I have no connection to it whatsoever? With the Iliad, I can understand like the eternal truths. Like the Iliad begins with rage, sing muse of Achilles'
of the rage
rage.
of Achilles. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas with Deadpool and Wolverine, they're like Cassandra. Oh man, Cassandra, she's got this entirely complex character arc I know nothing about. She's, this deeply sympathetic, tragic character, which I know nothing about. And it expects me to have so much cultural knowledge, which I don't have. And that's what I find so interesting about modern culture is that I was watching Family Guy clips earlier.
That is
Guilty
the modern
pleasure, Father.
touchstone of all culture, The Simpsons
Yeah,
and Family Guy clips. Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Like I was watching some Family Guy clips earlier, and they're referencing like half the actors I don't know. I don't know anything about. It's all limited to this very, very strict temporal, like just this very thin frame, which I know nothing about. And that's supposed to be the culture. Whereas like what I would conceive as culture, ideally conceive as culture, is something like it's something reaching at eternal truths. Like I'm
I mean,
looking at
and
cathedral as
these shows like The Simpsons and Family Guy, they've relied on their humor for there being some kind of American mainstream culture, which there isn't anymore. So they're all just hitting this button that doesn't even work. Even South Park has suffered for this. South Park went downhill precipitously when it hit the Great Awakening because it could no longer get a handle on what normalcy actually meant. And its humor relied on that to a certain extent. Its political commentary relied on that.
Yeah, I remember watching the early seasons of South Park, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is gay." They had entire episodes dedicating to arguing for gayness, and then their modern episodes they were sort of trying to poke fun at themselves, but even then that failed because like I I honestly I don't understand what South Park stands for except for poking fun at everything.
Well,
And
I mean, they're
eventually,
libertarians. I mean, okay, maybe I should, as a former South Park fan, I still kind of have a fond spot for it. In the 90s, the idea was just to see how far they could push the envelope. And it was only, I think it came out in 1999. So it was only a few seasons that were in the 90s properly. Well, maybe it was 97. I forget, but it was only like 3 years or so. But then as they transitioned into the 2000s, after the movie came out, which was literally about its own censorship, and they kind of were forced to develop ideas that were outside of censorship. The belief of the filmmakers was that people are too ideological, people fall into trends too quickly. I mean, this is there's literally these ideas literally come out in the actual show. And that's what people call themselves South Park Republicans, by which they meant kind of libertarian Republicans. People take themselves too seriously. They fall into trends too easily. And if we all just kind of got a hold of our own egos and followed common sense, people would be kind of sort of all right in the end. But the problem is that in 2012, we realized that just wasn't true. there was no indestructible normalcy or common sense that would reassert itself. And not all ideological trends would just burn out instantly. Some would just completely take over society and force you to acknowledge them, like COVID. And in the context of a society where ideology actually has real consequences and there is no common sense, the kind of libertarian perspective that they were trying to push, it was fundamentally incoherent.
Yeah,
That's my spiel.
I saw the announcement that they weren't doing the South Park season this year because they said that all that has been said about Donald Trump has already been said. I'm like, you absolute cowards.
I can think of a few things.
You're not going to talk about Kamala Harris in this
Yeah, Kamala Harris has been. I can think of a few things about her that haven't been said, but we will, and that South Park would, in an other age, be very, very ready to say about anybody. But of course, when real power comes down, libertarianism is weak. I'll go on here. So, like Michael Latorno for $3 USA. Dave, do you think that it's possible that a return to traditionalism is just the result of the culture shift motivating people to try a new way of being edgy and countercultural? i.e., religion is now hip? Well, and I think there's going to be kind of a false religious hipness that comes about. This will not be a real religious revival, but just sort of a reaction against the sourness of atheism writ large. But conversely, I think that a lot of very strong people will be born from that accidentally. They'll rediscover religion and then discover something deeper behind that religiosity. But I don't know. Do you have any comments?
To frame religion as hip is sort of to misunderstand what religion is. So I would say, in regards to that topic entirely, is that the hipness kind of implies a fadness, a temporal passing of the time, that what is awesome is going to be awesome, and then suddenly it's not going to be awesome anymore. I don't think there are certainly aspects of religion that are hip in that sense, and that you can say, oh, okay, this thing is based or whatever. And there's always going to be that internet meme culture. But the real kernel of Christianity and religion in general is that you would have something that is motivating, that is powerful, that is creative, and it's eternally so in every moment. And you would want that in every moment.
Yeah. And I mean, it wouldn't be defined in opposition to itself like all fashion trends are. I mean, I know inevitably we're going to get religious hipsters. In some sense, we already have in the Times Square scene. I mean, you've seen the whole stuff. I mean, maybe you haven't, but a lot of the whole hipsterdom surrounding people like the Red Scare podcast has been sucked into aesthetic versions of Christianity that are obviously fake. I don't know. I mean, a lot of Catholics have commented on this that I've known, that just say, let this play out. It is what it is. And the people who are serious will stay.
Yes. That's the only real test is, do you stay for like 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or are you in this for the long haul?
I'd be skeptical of the traditionalism thing that came out like 2 years ago. That's kind of in the process of fading. I mean, it's these things have to be done in real life. People just bragging about their trad lifestyles on Instagram is just so transparently fake. And it's not that I'm saying, I'm obviously traditional mores and traditional lifestyles are healthier. By all means, pursue that which is healthy and which is good. But its existence as an online trend has been cringe from day one, as far as I'm concerned. And it's been transparently fake as well.
So I mean, the real trad lifestyle isn't online to begin with. That's
Yeah,
that's
of
that's,
course.
that's the
Yeah.
issue. Is that if you're living that real trad lifestyle, you're not going to be posting, Instagram feeds or TikTok videos of how you're living the good life.
I've heard
That's
some
the
people
problem.
like Peachy Keenan. I don't know if you know her. She's she's a writer slash Twitter personality slash co-host of the New Right Post. I've her or guest host. I've heard her describe the trad thing on Instagram and on TikTok and YouTube as being kind of like aspirational for women, the way that there used to be like these aspirational women's magazines back in the 90s. I don't know. Maybe there's a niche for that that's necessary for, in particular, women to follow. But from a male point of view, it just doesn't look right, I guess.
I mean, the problem is that it's in order for it to be real, it'd have to be in IRL. It'd have to be authentic to the living community that exists.
Mhm.
The problem with pushing incentives from a digital perspective is that it's always fake to some degree. Uh, I mean, there's always a trend chasing from the algorithm that you encounter in every single profile.
Yeah, 100%.
And you just there's this disconnect. It always has to be IRL. It always has to be IRL to be authentic. Otherwise, it's sort of trying to reach at the authentic in digital spaces.
Which is always a difficult thing. This is also what we learned about community building, is that it only could be real if it existed after in real life organization or in tandem with real life organization. And that's the only way it could take root, and that was a necessary first step. Xander P for $15. Could Isaac give us an idea of what his book is like? Well, you have several of them, but I'm not going to blab about this, Isaac. Could you give a rundown of your most recent ones, or the ones that you're the most proud of, I should say?
It's a long story. Okay. So the first one is the Matryoshka Divide, which is a classic sci-fi style, I'd say Isaac Asimov space opera about trying to understand psychohistory through a Christian lens. And what I was trying to reach out through the Matryoshka Divide was how Christianity transcended this abolition of man style lens of how we can perfectly predict human behavior. That was my first novel. I've got a lot more in the works. So I guess the second one, which I want to cover, is the superhero dystopia story I call Gay Heroes. It started as a joking riff story off of The Boys. If you ever heard that one, that's a lot of that.
Aware of the
Story.
memes.
That's one the right wing consistently likes to dunk on.
Yeah.
But I was really fascinated with the celebrity take on superheroes, where we're gonna take the superhuman, we're gonna take it, and we're gonna make it very fallen, very destructive, and we're gonna take the normal human and we're gonna possess that, and we're gonna take that as the superior. And what I wanted to get at Giga Heroes was that there was a real aristocratic class, and that class is not defined so much by their superpowers, but rather by their willingness to do good in the world. That the real aristocrats are not people who are blessed with these superhuman talents, as Marvel would have you believe, where you have powers and naturally because of those powers you do good, rather because you do good that you are considered aristocratic. And that's Giga Heroes is my second main project. It's I have to the full story is published completely. I have to edit it and get it published in an Amazon format, but you can read the rough draft on my Substack. The third main story is The Domes of Calrathia, which is a dark fantasy story where I was trying to get at a commentary on the collapse of civilization, where I have the main thrust of the story is this character is called Cirrus. He's trying to basically take this book to this holy pilgrimage site where it's preserved and where, where he's trying to make this holy pilgrimage and trying to preserve history for its own sake. Fortunately, I didn't prepare elevator TV.
No, it's fine. I think
pilots.
that one's still in production, though, right?
Yeah, that's only 23 chapters so far. And the last production I have so far is called The Last Human, which is about a post-human galaxy where humanity has been rendered all but extinct. And what I wanted to get at with this particular project was sort of the physical realities of real nation building. So, for example, in this project, I have this character called Amon Russ, who's basically his entire society, the human civilization, sacrifices itself for this ideological cause. And this warrior, he's sort of like a archetype of the global war on terror, where he looks back on this enterprise and he sees that the ideological causes might have been right, but that came at the cost of all the reactionary causes where we basically sacrificed a homogenous society, a human society, for a how do I put this in the right words? We sacrificed a particular society for the universal society, and the universal society came at a great cost that was ultimately not worth it in the end. And that's why I kind of want to get at this particular sci-fi project. I only have 4 chapters.
It kind of reminds me of the Forever War in that sense, I guess. Next question, Creeper Weirdo for I'll get you another chance to pitch your books at the end, but I need to get through these super chats first. Creeper Weirdo for $3 says, weird question, but have you two weird question for you to answer, but is irony dead? Do you want to take that one? It's dead, but only ironically. I
mean, irony only means something insofar as it points to a real thing. And insofar as that is the case, irony is dead because it doesn't really point to anything more than the superficial elements. So when I engage in irony in Giga Heroes, for example, advertising and shilling, I really try to point at this real virtue and heroism. Like, I try to point at this concept that humanity should be aiming at a greater picture than simply material comfort. And insofar that irony points at that thing, I think irony has a real use. But insofar as irony is sort of getting at, hey, I'm above the joke.
Well, I mean, that's the millennial pattern, is to cloak sincerity that you're ashamed of behind irony. This is something that Geo from Giant Art Productions pointed out. I mean, like, millennials will never admit to unironically liking something. They like things like Simpsons because they can quote it and use it as an imagistic basis for what they're trying to say. But then if you hold them to something or criticize the text, they get to say something like, oh, well, that's just a stupid show that I liked as a kid. It doesn't mean anything, man. And they can kind of escape from the ownership of the property by making a joke about it, ironically.
Yeah, it's. I'd really. I'd really love to see a show like The Simpsons or The Boys where it's taken 100% sincerely. And I really want to see what they truly actually believe. I don't think they ever have the courage to actually put that forward. But that's.
I will say this about woke movies is that they do accurately represent what people believe. It's just kind of weird and insane.
So the interesting thing about woke movies is that I was watching this YouTube show called Murder Robots, Murder Drone Bots, whatever. And the very interesting thing is in most stories, authors would have the redemptive element be built into the morality of the world building or the setting in general. For example, like Flannery O'Connor. When she writes a story, I think it was A Good Man Was Hard to Find, where she has a grandmother who witnesses the murder of her entire family and she forgives the murderer. And, she has this story about the absolute depravity of humankind. And the grandmother sort of fall on her knees and she's sort of trying to articulate a forgiveness. I know you spoke on this before.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it necessarily forgiveness. It's she kind of steps outside of her own selfishness and sees the condition of humanity, including the humanity of the man who's about to kill her. And she embraces, in the moment where she embraces her death, she kind of fully expresses the humanness of her own life.
So I was watching this show called Murder Robots or Murder Drones or whatever. And in that, like, you have that scene where there's this, like, the redemptive element is supposed to come in. And in the leftist Tumblr version of that, what you have, instead of the human trying to justify itself, you have the human trying to arbitrate itself, in a sense where the the girl boss hero says, "Oh, hey, maybe what I did was wrong, but what the patriarchal element my father did was way worse than that." and
That's
she
the ultimate
just
millennial cop out.
yeah, she just stands there and you fuck you. You did everything wrong, and I did. I was completely justified in everything I've done, and that's the end of the story.
Oh my god, it's the ultimate millennial cop out. The ultimate millennial belief that you're the generation that gets to judge all of history before and after you. It's perfect.
Yeah, it's Tumblr fan fiction.
Yeah,
I don't know how
absolutely.
else to describe it.
It's a real show.
Yeah. All right, so there's this another show. I think it's produced by the same company called The Amazing Digital Circus, which is a lot more real to the themes it's trying to get at, where it's trying to get at an atheistic, existentialist horror where the entirety of life is just LARPing. Everything in the world is just a video game. Whereas Murder Robots is just this horribly indescribably perverse commentary of, oh hey, I'm going to arbitrate morality to you where and that's a lot of thing I noticed with a lot of leftist fiction is where the characters were they would explain the details of their moral intricacies to their oppressors, whereas with a lot of right-wing reactionary fiction that would be self-evidently obvious. That's sort of the meme, whereas the left can't meme. They have to explain everything in like 100-word paragraphs where everything is like block. Here's XYZ of how I'm going to explain how you're completely wrong in your interpretation. Whereas the right wing, they only need to say, oh, X is Y, and their point is made.
Well said. Let's go into the first really generous super chat. Hi, Isaac from Chai Squared. Hi, Isaac. I'm an IRL friends with an artist who makes primarily fantasy and science fiction art. I could connect you with him for a book cover work. I can't promise Michael Whelan, but I could justify covering some of the costs myself since I'd be helping out a friend. If you're interested, I'll reach out to you on Twitter. Sounds like a potential opportunity.
Yeah, I reached out to me on Twitter. I mean, the problem is that I've been really busy these past 3 weeks. I've been
I know the feeling.
Job.
I very much know the feeling. Wait till you have kids.
Yeah, I've been working a serious job where I just been dog tired. I've been able to, but seriously, reach out to me. I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chai Squared. And thank you for the very generous super chat. Next, even more generous super chat from Memory Medieval. One for Isaac and similar others, with the state of institutions, you've got to apply the Promethean spirit that you have to making your work to also marketing and selling your work. 2, Dave, here's some gas money for your big trip. Well, it already happened, but thank you very much. I'll recoup it. Thank you. Certainly spent a lot on gas. Glad you made it. Glad you're back. Please don't forget to peep the audiobook when you can. Young man need inspiration. Okay, thank you. Will do. I think you sent me an audiobook. Thanks so much. And oh yeah, I had a promotion thing that I didn't. I'm a little bit unorganized right now, and several people asked me to do promotions, and I haven't gotten a chance to listen to that audiobook yet. But thank you very much for the recommendation. Did you have any reaction to the question about being Promethean in spirit, but also marketing and selling your work, Isaac?
I pray I'm not Promethean in spirit. Let's see. What I really want my work to be in the future, in terms of science fiction, is sort of trying to provide that religious component explicitly, whereas a lot of previous authors tried to underhand short sell religious meaning. I really want, as part of the genre I'm trying to create, is a religious science fiction, much like in the vein of Dune, where religion is taken as a serious topic that deserves serious consideration, whether it's other works would hand wave it aside.
Yeah, I mean, I'm selfish in this endeavor. I just want to have books that I can read and discuss with people again. So since there is no good literary community, we're going to have to build it. Hopefully from the basket weaving project, but we'll try starting there.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I'm running out of time and energy, so I'm going to accelerate the super chats here a little bit. Michael Atorno for $3 USA. Have you ever read Tom Holland's book Dominion? It's about how Christianity built the West. An excerpt from the book is how humanistic ideation is nothing but a godless Protestant ideology. Yes, I have read that a really long time ago. It's very good. And his thesis definitely seems to dovetail slightly with people like Curtis Yarvin. And other reactionary thinkers. I don't know if you have any comment on Tom Holland, Isaac.
Sorry, I don't. I wish I did.
No problem. Now, I mean, it's like one of those books you read a long time ago, and I kind of barely remember it, so I don't want to comment on it too much. All I can say is that his findings were very much in keeping with my own observation. Wokeism and humanism are absolutely Christian heresies, but they are absolutely, at this stage, defunct human heresies or defunct Christian heresies. They make zero sense in the modern world. Owen Zaleski for $5. Evening, gents. I hope you're all well. I'm an artist that is always interested in working with others who are like-minded for projects. Any advice on finding other opportunities? Shout out to Isaac for his effort to fight against the irony media literate. Well, yes, everyone were very much on your side in the whole media literacy wars of 2023. I always thought it would be fun to get one of those media literacy bros on this channel and hash it out with them. That would be good YouTube. If people were still in the market for good YouTube.
I mean, I always thought that, like, I was honestly surprised why they were actually got but the Star Troopers thread. Yeah, here's the thing with the whole debacle, because I wrote that as like I was on a I was literally running a 5-kilometer run in my neighborhood. I was like, boop boop boop. Here's my very a mediocre soft reaction towards Starship Troopers, and then the next day I got like 1 million views on Twitter. And I was like, oof. I remember specifically writing this bug, I can't relate to it in any way, shape, or form. And they were like, oh man, you can't relate to the bug? I would have a beer with the bug. I would drink a 6-pack with the bug.
That's just how open-minded I am. We if we didn't import the bugs, how will we have bug tacos to eat or whatever? pick your cliche.
And I was
Literal
like, the
bug
bug's
man
eating your brain. What do you want?
Yeah.
What do you want me to say here? It's like I remember the original Star Trek, like, boom, suck. Brain is eating all your, like, the bug is eating all your brain. I was like, what do you want me to? What do you want me to do here? I can't.
You got to appreciate their culture, Isaac. Come on, you know.
Yeah, I gotta watch the football game with the brain-eating bug here.
Well, and before we leave this one, any advice on artists looking to make new projects? It's always such a hard question, right? Because so much of this is just finding your own way in this digital wasteland that it's hard to kind of give like a how-to guide.
I mean, I would say the main thing for my how-to guide is just embracing religious truths. Again, I remember, I hate to go back to this, but it's literally my it's really the pinnacle of what I think fiction can reach to be is Book of the New Sun.
Yeah, that is a classic.
It reaches for this metaphysical truth that you really rarely see so much, like, science fiction sort of touches upon, but you never see science fiction really engage with the supernatural. You never really see science fiction engage with and I remember this quote from Book of the New Sun, whereas symbols are they act on their own will and they act upon us. And you never see such a line in Arthur C. Clarke or Isaac Asimov. They think that it is humanity, which it is humanity which bestows upon meaning the universe. It is never the universe acting upon humanity. It is never the world acting upon humanity. It is always humanity being the arbitrator of its own fate. You never see this supernatural, real, symbolic element which comes in, fulfills our lives, and gives us meaning.
I do hope that Gene Wolfe is known as the first truly 21st century author, the same way that in some sense Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were the first 20th century authors.
Yeah, like you look at such an author and you just wonder, where will his light come again?
Well, maybe I'm not as black-pilled as many people. I think that maybe things are going to change in this regard. But I'm going to move on to the last super chat from Michael Latorno for $3 USA. Dave, how much of a threat do you consider radical Islam? You said via Twitter that godlessness was the root problem, but don't you still worry about Islamic encroachment in the West? I don't think Islamic extremism is a problem because Islamic presence in the West is 100% a project of Western governments. If Western governments weren't importing Muslims, there would be no Muslims here. And they're not the only problematic group that the West is currently importing. There's tons of ethnic groups in sub-Saharan Africa. There was this news headline that came out the other day about some municipalities having problems with Kali worshippers sacrificing animals. I mean, like when you have populations that are sacrificing, making blood sacrifices to the dark gods, I think you have a bigger problem than the Mohammedan heresy. And ultimately, the source of all of these problems is the Western governments that continuously bring these people into our countries when they really have no reason to be here. And there's a whole apparatus that just can't get over this type of logic. And I oftentimes see this obsession with radical Islam as being a way to distract the boomers from the necessary task of just reasserting their own ownership over their birthright, and then also bequeathing it to the younger generations as their birthright. I mean, if you don't do that, you're never going to accomplish anything, regardless of whether it's Muslims or blood god worshipping Hindus coming into the country. And I know not all Hindus worship Kali and do this weird stuff, but I don't know. It seems that Islam is just a symptom of the modern cultural decline of the West. And before we fix what's actually going on underneath it all, I don't really see the point in freaking out about it. Any comments?
I mean, the main problem with Islam is the collapse of Christianity as the West.
Yeah. If Christianity collapses, I'm not going to be surprised if Islam takes over. Nature abhors a vacuum. Yeah. Creeper Weirdo for $3. This one is the last one, hopefully. Have either of you guys read Jonathan Pagow's Snow White and the Widow Queen? Great comic book, almost as good as real books. I haven't. Have you had a chance to read that one?
I haven't either.
I used to read graphic novels all the time. I was particularly fond of a few French authors. But now they're so expensive, and I would almost always rather be reading an actual nonfiction book. I'm not the biggest fiction reader. Sorry, Isaac. I do very much appreciate your literary criticism, but it's very difficult for me to polish off a novel. It takes a lot of effort. And my backlog is almost entirely comprised of people wanting me to review various nonfiction books. But from what I've read of your fiction, it's also really good. So I both heartily recommend your Substack, Tranter Publishing, for the literature reviews, which I've read all of, and also the fiction installments, of which I've read some of. So I think that's more or less about it, Isaac. It is for my time. Do you want to plug your channel again and give any parting thoughts this evening?
Yeah, it's always a bit awkward for me to shill.
You
And I
gotta get.
never find.
I never liked it either. Like, share, and subscribe to the Distributist YouTube channel.
Yeah, it's always been a bit sickly.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to find a good way to show my to try to not be arrogant about it, because that's how everything else comes off as is we're gonna be the best product possible. But what I'm trying to do on a general scale is trying to provide a fiction scene alternative to mainstream Hollywood, where Christianity is placed not at the hallmark stereotypical Protestant evangelical forefront, where we're all just gonna have a nice time. But I really want to try and get at a real Christianity where humanity is engaged with as it is, instead of this utopian paradisical fantasy reality that boomers try to force upon us.
Well said. And once more, I'll encourage all of my followers and viewers to check out your stuff at Trantra Publishing. I forgot to include a link, but I'll put one in at the end of the show tonight so that it should be here by tomorrow morning. And thank you so much for joining me, Isaac. I hope to be reading your stuff and talking to you in the future.
Yep. Thank you too.
Have a good night.
You too.